The area that we are about to walk through is one that I'm told the estate agents class as very desirable. It's just on the outskirts of the city centre, and at one point the Times newspaper voted it as the 9th coolest place to live. But I often wonder how many people that live here today are actually aware of the story that we're about to uncover, because I just happened to come across it in an old booklet. There's not actually a lot about it on the internet. In fact, I couldn't find any other YouTube videos about this particular topic and this particular person anywhere apart from the odd sort of folklore ballad, and they were pretty good actually. But so hopefully it's a fairly new story I'm bringing to you. Let me know after you've watched the video if you do know about this person. Every village, town and city in the world has its own cast of characters, each one contributing to the tapestry of the place. There are those who move quietly through life, rarely drawing attention to themselves, causing no bother and asking very little of the world around them. And then there are others, people who stand out for one reason or another, those who don't quite blend into the background, who might be described as eccentric, unusual, or simply a little out of step with the ordinary. We often refer to these people with affection. You'll hear someone smile and say, "Oh, I liked him, he was a character." People like this bring colour to our communities usually. They offer different ways of seeing the world, fresh perspectives in places that can sometimes feel very set in their ways. Most of the time, going against the grain is harmless, refreshing even. But there are moments when eccentricity crosses into something else entirely, something darker, something more troubling. And sometimes the people living closest to it can see it happening, but have very little power to stop it. Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire. This is The Wanderlust Way. First off, let me say a massive thank you to everybody that supports the channel by liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, pressing the hype button, and a special thanks to everybody that sends those donations and is a member, because you're the ones that are keeping that teapot topped up. Okay, and it's allowing me to carry on with stories like this and adventures. So today's story, it is a bit of a grim one, this one, I'm not going to lie to you, and at this point I will say that it's a bit of a viewer discretion. I know you expect that often on these videos that there is going to be a little bit of gore, and this one it does contain animal suffering and death. So I'm just going to give you that warning now, in case you want to choose away, in case this video is not quite what you're looking for, because I'm going to be leaving all those gory details in, because I believe it's part of the story and it's a reminder of the history, and hopefully it prevents things like this happening again if we bring these stories to light. Anyway, let's get on with this. That is enough waffle. Let's wander. This area on the outskirts of the city centre of York is known as Clementhorpe, I believe, and it houses areas such as Bishopthorpe Road, which is behind me, and Terry Avenue, which is named, of course, after the famous Terry family, the ones that made the chocolate orange. So let's just take a pause for a moment and appreciate the chocolate orange, because that's about as light as this story is going to get. For this story, we're going back to about 200 years, to the 1800s, and we're going to learn about a man named Lumley Kettlewell. Now, Lumley Kettlewell lived in a property in this area, and unfortunately, I could find no historic records that would actually tell me the exact location of his house. I believe it's probably been pulled down or anything by now, but if you are a local historian and you do know, then please do let us know in the comments. But yeah, this is the sort of area that he lived in, and this is where a lot of our story takes place. Lumley Kettlewell was born near Bolton Percy, around 12 miles from central York. He was the son of a wealthy farmer. His fortune, education and upbringing placed him comfortably among the respectable classes of York society. He was well-spoken, polite, intelligent. Contemporary accounts describe him as possessing a superior mind, and those who met him often remarked on the gentleness of his manners and the civility of his conversation. Early in life, he embraced the pleasures available to a man of his standing. He excelled in the sports of the field. He kept blood horses and game dogs. He moved easily among people of means. In every expected sense of the word, he was a gentleman. And that's perhaps what makes this story so unsettling. Because for reasons no one could ever fully explain, Lumley Kettlewell walked away from it all. Not a dramatic outburst, not through scandal or ruin, but through a quiet, deliberate renunciation of comfort, society, and the ordinary rhythms of life. He was about 30 years old when this happened, and from what I can read, there was no great announcement or anything like that. He just slowly started to withdraw from warmth, from nourishment, and from companionship. Before this, he'd been apprenticed to an eminent haberdasher and had become a member of the Merchant Adventurers Company, a respectable, stable path by any measure. But in his 30s, he began to fixate on increasingly peculiar ideas, particularly around eating and the necessity of food itself. And so it was here on the outskirts of this bustling city that Lumley Kettlewell began to reshape his life, following a philosophy that only he could truly understand. Lumley came to believe that the human body didn't require as much sustenance as people assumed, that hunger, weakness, even illness were not inevitable but learned, that with discipline the body could be trained to endure far more than civilization allowed it to. Now in his mind this was logical, almost scientific. He believed food, at least in the quantities people consumed it, was unnecessary, perhaps even harmful. And like many people convinced they have uncovered a hidden truth, Lumley felt compelled to prove it. What is particularly worrying about this, it's not just about what Lumley Kettlewell believed, it's about the human mind and how it can give us confidence in something that other people find absolutely and completely irrational. History is full of examples where new ideas were dismissed, ridiculed, even attacked, only to later be proven right. Imagine being the person convinced the world wasn't flat when everyone around you insisted it was. You'd have to believe utterly and completely that you were right, even when the rest of society told you that you were wrong. We see this again and again through history. I mean, think about names like Galileo and Einstein, and even the Wright brothers, who believed that they could put an aircraft into the sky and fly. And so many people didn't believe them. So many people said it was impossible. And sometimes it takes people that go against the grain to actually make progress happen in the first place. Progress often comes from people willing to go against the grain. And somewhere in the back of Lumley Kettlewell's mind, he may well have believed he was one of them, that he had stumbled upon a truth others simply couldn't see yet. But while stubborn belief has sometimes pushed humanity forward, there are other times like this where the obsession to prove a point and the refusal to accept evidence to the contrary becomes deeply dangerous, especially when that belief stops being tested only on the self and begins to affect others who have no choice at all. To the people living nearby, Lumley Kettlewell became something of a curiosity. I mean, he was wealthy, he was well educated, but he was completely reclused as a hermit. His home, it is said, was completely barricaded off to the rest of the world, and no other human being was allowed inside. The front door was permanently secured from within, so strongly barricaded that it was never used at all. Instead, Lumley entered and exited his home by climbing a ladder and slipping through a small opening that had once been a window. Neighbours watched this strange routine day after day. They saw him come and go, carrying sacks, bundles, and odd collections of materials. They saw him disappear inside again, sealing himself away from view. But the house itself was so uninviting, so closed, so forbidding, that no one truly knew what was happening inside. Inside, it was said that Lumley rejected every ordinary comfort. In fact, he didn't even sleep in a bed. He slept in a crate filled with hay. His clothing, once respectable, became increasingly strange. A jumble of garments that seemed to belong to different lives entirely. A fur cap worn with a ballroom coat. Hussar boots paired with oilskin jackets. At other times, a tall London hat set above the torn remains of black silk stockings. He left money lying openly on windowsills and chairs, so neglected that banknotes were sometimes eaten away by rats. To those that encountered him in the street, it was said that he was always polite and gentlemanly. In fact, he earned the nickname around here as the Gentleman Hermit. From the outside, neighbours could only observe fragments. A ladder raised and lowered, a figure vanishing through a window, long hours of absence followed by a quiet return. What lay beyond that barricaded door was a mystery. Just what was he doing in there? By the end of this video, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to understand the full extent of what he actually did. But for now, let us just try and get our head around the actual theory surrounding his philosophy of life. This was not about money. Lumley Kettlewell had wealth, property and income enough to live comfortably. What drove him, we are told, was fascination. A deep and stubborn belief that human beings did not truly need to eat as much as society claimed. Nor, in his view, did they need warmth, comfort or abundance. According to various contemporary accounts, his own diet was sparse and peculiar. Some neighbours believed he lived largely on milk and vegetables. Others recalled seeing him gather animal offcuts discarded into the street by poulterers, scraps most people wouldn't have touched. He was known to visit bakers regularly, buying bread for himself but always in very small quantities, nothing lavish, nothing indulgent. Food, when he did take it, seemed to be reduced to function rather than pleasure. Warmth, too, was something he denied himself. Despite owning property, he rarely heated, if ever, his own home. Instead, during the colder months, he sought out other people's fires, sitting quietly by kitchen hearths for hours, sometimes sleeping there overnight, curled on chairs or stretched out on the stone floor. Taken together, this paints the picture of a man deliberately stripping life back to what he believed was its bare minimum. To Lumley, this was proof, evidence that the body could be trained to endure far more than most people imagined. And for a time, his theories were tested only on himself. But belief has a way of demanding more, because it's one thing to test an idea on your own body, and quite another to begin testing it further. We're in what's known as the Pavement area of York now, and this is where a lot of Lumley Kettlewell's friends lived. This is where he came to sort their companionship and warmth on an evening. And this is around the area where the story is going to take, shall we say, a plot twist of such. And this is where the whole thing is going to unravel, and we're going to actually find out what Lumley Kettlewell is capable of. The Pavement has always been a place where lives crossed. Long before it became a familiar shopping street, this was Marketshire, one of York's earliest marketplaces, and possibly the first paved street in the city. It was wider than most streets by design, an open space in a city of narrow lanes, a place built not for privacy, but for gathering. Traders, messengers, proclamations read aloud, and sometimes punishments carried out in full public view. This was a street where news travelled fast and where the city watched together. It's around a 10 to 15 minute walk from Clementhorpe, depending on the route you take, close enough to reach on foot, but far enough to feel like stepping out of one world and into another. In the early 1800s, there of course was no pizza place here. There was no M&S coffee shop, no glowing shop fronts offering warmth at the press of a door. But there was one familiar landmark that's still here. The Golden Fleece stood on this street, just as it does now, firelit, busy and full of voices. Now, if you are curious about its long history of the Golden Fleece and the reported hauntings, I have explored that story in more detail in an earlier video on York's haunted pubs, so there's just a little bit of a shameless plug there for you. Anyway, we don't know exactly when Lumley Kettlewell first began coming here. We don't even know if he drank in the Golden Fleece. Perhaps he did, who knows. But by the later years of his life, this was somewhere he returned to often. Here, between St Crux at one end and All Saints at the other, he could find something he denied himself elsewhere. Company, warmth and a fire to sit beside. Friends lived close by, doors opened here, and for a while at least, the cold and isolation of Clementhorpe were held at bay. This street had witnessed centuries of life, belief, punishment and defiance long before Lumley ever walked its stones. And now, unknowingly, it was witnessing the quiet routine of a man whose darkest secrets still lay sealed behind another door, waiting to be discovered. We're now standing in what is Lady Peckett's yard, just off the pavement in York, and this is where our story takes an unexpected turn of events. It was September 1819. Summer was giving way to autumn, and Lumley Kettlewell, the eccentric at the centre of our story, had left his peculiar home at Clementhorpe to make his way towards the Pavement in York. Here lived a friend of his, a bookbinder named Smith. By this stage in his life, Lumley had begun to make regular visits here, particularly as the night started to draw in. He would sit quietly by his friend's fire, accepting the warmth he so firmly denied himself at home. As darkness crept in, Lumley made his way once again towards the familiar building. The exact location of Smith's lodgings is uncertain to me. Now, if you are a local historian and you know the exact site, then please do let us know in the comments. But an account written at the time gives us a vivid picture of the place and what happened next. That article describes the building as extremely ancient and spacious, divided into tenements and workshops, entered by a flight of stone steps and a massive stair gallery, set within a court known as Lady Peckett's yard. Shops occupied the ground floor, their fronts facing the busy marketplace. But by 1819, the structure had fallen into serious disrepair. Time, neglect and pillage had taken their toll. The public office that once occupied part of the building had already been removed, and the whole place was said to be mouldering fast, particularly those parts exposed to the elements. The entrance steps, though wide and imposing at first glance, were dangerously unsound. The brick parapets that had once guarded either side had collapsed, leaving open cavities where protection should have been. And it was in this condition, on a dark evening in September, that Lumley began to climb those steps. He had scarcely reached the first landing, feeling his way through the darkness in an area and in a routine that he had done many times before. But this time something different happened. He lost his footing and he slipped and he fell into a side cavity of the building. He fell several feet. The shock alone was enough to badly shake his already weakened frame. But as he fell, a loose stone, the very one he had either stepped on or grasped for sport, dislodged and came down with him, striking him and injuring him severely. Stunned by the suddenness of the fall, Lumley lay helpless until his friend, who happened to be nearby, rushed to his aid and helped him up. What at first appeared to be a serious but not too serious accident would soon prove to be far more than that. In the days that followed, Lumley was said to be in a very sad state of affairs, and it was his friends that got him through these few days. They cared for him, they looked after him, and I wonder now, knowing what I know, whether they would have cared for him in that same way if they knew exactly what he'd been getting up to. While Lumley remained injured, he stayed in an apartment where he was able to sit continually by a comfortable fireside, a warmth he had so often denied himself. Here the assistance of Mrs. Smith and her family proved invaluable. They tended to him, helped care for him, and allowed him to remain by the hearth for long stretches of the day. Despite his injuries, Lumley expressed gratitude to those who came to see him, thanking visitors for their concern and speaking confidently of a speedy recovery. But while Lumley was being cared for here, something else was unfolding back at his house in Clementhorpe. At the time of his fall, he had left behind what was believed to be the last remnants of the livestock he kept there. A fine setting dog, along with a hen and her chickens, all tied up and entirely dependent upon him. They were not thought of immediately. When attention was finally turned to them, some time had already passed. The dog, driven by hunger, had become dangerous to approach. It was only after a piece of dried fish was thrown to him, enough to dull the sharp edge of starvation, that anyone dared come close enough to free him. The animals were then removed and brought nearer to their injured master. In doing so, they were preserved, saved from the brink that others, before them, had already crossed.
Lumley Kettlewell never fully recovered from that fall, and he slowly started to deteriorate until Monday the 10th of January 1820 he died. He was, it was said, 69 years of age.
There's no dramatic medical explanation recorded, no single cause that neatly ties everything together, but when you consider the life he had led, years of denying himself warmth, nourishment and comfort, it's hard not to feel that, by the end, his body simply didn't have much left to give.
Now, his death may have seemed like a sad but unremarkable conclusion to an eccentric way of life, but in truth it was only the beginning, and the phrase skeletons in the closet may come to mind. Now, it might just be a metaphor, but in this case it was horrifyingly real. This is the site of St Crux Church in central York. Now, when the site was first built, it was recorded in the Domesday Book, so it just shows you how old it was. Now, the original church isn't here now, but they have rebuilt the hall behind us, which is in the stones of that church. Now, this is the site where Lumley Kettlewell's funeral took place, and it's also where very important people have been buried over the years, including Thomas Percy, the 7th Earl of Northumberland. Now, he was the one that was executed by Elizabeth I for treason, for the uprising. There's also Lord Mayors as well buried here too. This is the site that Lumley Kettlewell was buried.
It was at the site of Crux Church that the funeral of Lumley Kettlewell took place, attended, so I'm told, by respectable relatives and a small number of friends, people who, while disapproving of many aspects of his life, believed that a mind as strong as his was still deserving of dignity in death, and of kindness in the final offices owed to any human being. And it was only after this, once those final duties had been carried out, that attention turned back to his house at Clementhorpe, a place that had, until now, remained sealed, and when it was finally entered and cleared, no power of pen or pencil, it was said, could adequately convey what was found inside.
Now, it's said that the people that were living around Lumley Kettlewell, they weren't ignorant to what was going on. A lot of them were suspicious, especially around his involvement with animals, because many of them would actually refuse to sell animals to him. There was one case about he wanted to purchase this grey donkey, and he knew that nobody would sell it to him, so he actually ended up going through a third party, and that was the only way sometimes that he could actually get his hands on some of these animals, because people were suspicious.
There were moments when public concern boiled over. On one occasion, Lumley was seen carrying a newly dropped foal through the streets, cradled in his arms like a fawn. The sight caused such alarm that he was stopped by a crowd and forced to surrender the animal. Only later did he manage to recover it. His dogs were sometimes seen in such poor condition that they could scarcely fend for themselves, wandering in search of scraps among refuse heaps and slaughter yards. As these incidents accumulated, Lumley's reputation changed. To some, he remained an eccentric curiosity. To others, he had become something darker, a man people watched with suspicion, and sometimes open hostility. And yet, despite all of this, despite the rumours, the uneasy sightings, and the growing reluctance to deal with him, no one truly knew what was happening behind the barricaded doors of his house. They could only see what went in, and wonder why so little ever seemed to come back out.
On the Monday morning following Lumley's funeral, it was time for the clean-up operation, and men were sent in, said to clear the pathway in what they described was a Golgotha of animal suffering.
As they began to dig through the filth and decay, terrible things were uncovered, buried within layers of excrement and rotting vegetable matter. Upstairs, away from the worst of it, lay the bones of a blood mare, and beside her, the smaller bones of her foal. Only then did people begin to understand what had truly been going on inside that house. A pamphlet written at the time tried, and struggled, to put the scene into words. "Let me thy comforts here explain, receptacle of wind and rain, chimney which never sent forth smoke, walls, plaster, doors and windows broke, and to improve thy dismal state, dung, dirt and filth around thee wait." The house itself was small. It was mostly the 3 rooms on the ground floor that were occupied. Inside those lower rooms was a chaos of decay. Broken tin and copper utensils lay piled together with rusted tools and fragments of chemical equipment. Dried plants and vegetables were scattered among sacks, ropes, and the skins of animals. His scarlet hunting coat, once a symbol of wealth and status, lay ruined along with fine clothing from earlier years, eaten away by moths and rats. Boots and shoes lay everywhere, far more than one man could ever wear. There were bottles and jars filled with strange compounds, mixtures used for medicine and animal treatment. Old iron, chains, broken jugs and cracked pots, swords and sickles, a saddle, leather straps in abundance. Furniture was almost non-existent. There was a single stool, and a crude pallet, once stuffed with flock, now repaired with nothing more than straw. The windows were broken and crudely patched, doors hung loose or were missing altogether, locks and keys were useless. The stairs were badly damaged, handrails torn away, fireplaces dislodged, mantelpieces gone. Everything was coated in mould, cobwebs and corrosion, strewn in heaps across the floors, crammed beneath stairs and into cupboards that had long since lost their doors. Rats nestling in the adjoining stable moved freely throughout the house. And beneath it all, under layers of filth and rotting matter, lay the remains. 19 skeletons, unearthed one by one from what had become that hellhole of animal suffering. This was not a single act, not a moment of neglect. It was the slow, deliberate accumulation of years.
What was uncovered in that house wasn't accidental, and it wasn't anything to do with money or wealth, because the acts that he was doing were completely deliberate.
What the remains inside the house finally revealed was intent. Lumley Kettlewell had been using animals to test his theories. Not once, but again and again. He did not choose animals that were weak or unwanted. He deliberately sought out some of the finest creatures money could buy. Blood horses, hunting dogs, strong animals bred for stamina and endurance. Animals that, in almost any other hands, would have lived very different lives. Instead, they were brought into his sealed world. What Lumley believed and what he was determined to prove was that nourishment was unnecessary, that bodies could be trained to survive on far less than nature appeared to demand. By day he wandered the city and countryside foraging for plants, roots and vegetation. By night, while the rest of the neighbourhood slept, he worked in darkness at the back of his house, grinding, mixing and preparing crude substitutes for feed.
So this was the theory. The animals, they were fed just once a day. They were given just enough now, not enough for it to be nourishing in any way, but enough for them to sort of get through.
After feeding them, Lumley would lock the house and leave again, spending the day away while the animals remained confined inside that sealed space. As they weakened, the theory wasn't questioned. When they declined, the method was just adjusted, never the belief itself. Some animals became so weak they could no longer stand. They were suspended in slings to keep them upright. And when they died, their places were simply filled with new animals, brought in to continue the experiment. Again and again and again. What lay beneath the floor of that house was not the result of neglect or ignorance. It was the accumulated record of an obsession, one pursued relentlessly, even as the evidence mounted against it.
When I first came across this story, it was amongst the pages of a book about Yorkshire customs, and it was just a tiny little section of the book. And when I first read it, I thought I was absolutely horrified about what had happened. But what I was even more horrified about is that when I started researching it, there was very little about this character, Lumley Kettlewell, that I could find. There was some very interesting historical pamphlets that I managed to uncover that had been scanned in from the British Library, I believe. And that's where most of the information for this video has come from. But it's obviously a story that's not wanted to be remembered as part of York's history. It's not as important as some of those other things that have happened. But I just wonder what you guys think about that. Do you think we shouldn't probably dwell on these terrible things that have happened? Should we push them under the carpet and just forget about them? Or do you think it is important to keep these in public memory? So it might hopefully prevent things like this happening again in the future. I think so. I think it's important to know these stories and keep talking about them, and hopefully it doesn't happen again. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you again for joining me on today's Wander. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep wandering.
The world Lumley Kettlewell lived in was very different to our own. In the early 1800s, animal welfare laws were limited, loosely enforced, and in many cases they didn't yet exist at all. Concern could be voiced, but protection was far from guaranteed. Since then, I'm hoping much has changed. Across many countries, animals are now recognised as beings that require care, nourishment and protection, not property to be used without consequence. And while no system is perfect, the intention is there. That progress matters because animals don't have a voice in the way we do. They rely on observation, compassion and action from the people around them. This story reminds us that ownership does not equal entitlement, and that concern, when acted upon, can make a real difference. If there's anything to take from this forgotten chapter of history, perhaps it's this. Kindness isn't passive, and silence, however well-intentioned, can allow suffering to continue unseen. We can't change what happened here, but we can choose to be more aware, more compassionate, and more willing to speak up when it matters.